morning. Today we are talking to Advocate Mohammed Ali, who is a labor lawyer specialist, and we're talking about everything you need to know about working from home. Good morning, Mohammed.
Good morning. Thank you, dear. Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Thanks.
So, Mohammed, things are completely different for both the company and an employee. Working from home is something that is going to be taking place into the foreseeable future. What is it that companies need to know when they contract with their employees? And what is it that an employee needs to know about their employment contract that they need to look out for?
Look, let's just place this into context first. You know, there are a lot of uncertainties in respect of how long the lockdown is going to last and the effects of the pandemic is going to last. And we don't know whether we're going to be reversing these decisions to go into hard lockdown or not.
Yes.
But companies need to move on in order for the economy to be kickstarted.
Yeah.
For those employers who are in a position to have the employees work from home, they may have to ensure that certain resources are provided to those employees so that they can work from home. For example, they may need laptops, they may need access to Wi-Fi, they may need other resources that are required, and they may need to be linking to the company server.
Do they need to amend employment contracts as well?
Well, this is where the trick is going to be. And employment contracts will have to be amended, not to the extent of altering them at this point in time. We don't know what the future holds, and as to whether employees will in fact get back to the workplace, a traditional office environment. But employment contracts will have to be amended only to the effect that employees are going to be remunerated for tasks that are now completed. It's not necessarily going to be on a time-based system as it was before.
What about those who are required to take a salary cut? Is this linked to the fact that you're now output remunerated? Or is this just as a result of budget constraints? What happens in that case?
You know, that's I think a peculiar question that each employer will have to determine. Keep in mind that they no longer have to maintain offices. They don't need resources in order to maintain these offices. Tasks are going to be allocated to employees for which they're going to be paying. So maybe the offset in some of the costs can be used to subsidize salaries so that employers do not have to cut salaries. Right. If they do have to cut salaries, then that has to be by agreement between the employer and the employee. That can't be unilaterally imposed upon any employee regarding his or her ability to work from home or not.
In your opinion, what are the three top watch-outs for a company whose employees are working from home? And what are the three watch-outs for an employee who is now required to work from home?
Well, I don't think I can identify three in each case, but let's try. Okay. All right. I think the first thing is confidentiality.
Right.
Employers are going to require employees to have access to certain work from home. And they're going to have to ensure that the employees keep that information confidential and that doesn't get distributed to all and sundry. I can't see any other sort of major areas that employers would have to look at, because everything else is going to be it's going to be managed. And management of that could happen remotely.
Okay.
You know, supervisors can ask for tasks, even partial tasks, to be sent to ensure that there is a certain level of progress that is being achieved in the completion of the task. So there would have to be some sort of supervision and management remotely as well. And you probably would have to ask your employees to come in every now and then for a meeting in order just to confirm whether they are on track doing the tasks and if that is being achieved.
And the question that everybody's asking, who's responsible for testing of employees, the payment of the test? If there's a suspected COVID case, does the employer have to pay, or is it the responsibility of the employee? And I'm thinking specifically about those who may not have access to medical aid.
Well, that's a question that has plagued a lot of employers under these circumstances. The issue in respect of who should be paying for the test, I think, is linked to where the person was exposed to COVID.
Okay.
You know, under normal circumstances and outside of this environment, an employer wasn't required to pay for medical aid or to pay for a doctor's consult if an employee got sick.
Of course,
that was
the
never there.
fundamental difference, yes.
Absolutely. I mean, that was never there. But if an employee was exposed to COVID at the workplace, I think there
Mhm.
would be an onus upon the employer to assist in order to ensure that that employee is tested and is made safe. It would probably link to the employer's responsibility to ensure a safe workplace as well.
Ah, okay.
Right. So I would suggest that
Yes.
employers under those circumstances consider payment for those tests if it's linked to the workplace.
Mohammed, I
Good
think
pleasure.
the key takeout out of our conversation for us today is know the basic conditions of employment. This is on the part of the company as
Yeah.
well as on the part of the employee. And then ask the right questions in order to ensure that this new normal is actually easily accommodated by both the company and the employee. Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me. Thank you.
Joining me now via Skype is Fiona Martin, an industrial psychologist. Welcome, Fiona. Now that companies have employees working from home, what is the role of employee well-being? Is there still a need for companies to ensure that employees' well-being is taken care of?
I think the first thing that companies need to consider is that we're not only dealing with workload, but we're also dealing with significantly more life load, right? So that means obviously, living through a pandemic, having had to make significant shifts to the way that we live, homeschooling kids, there's so many dynamics that, were introduced, which needs to be taken into consideration. So is it really business as usual, right? And I think for many companies, what they're actually realizing is, can we expect the same level of productivity when we have to share our mental resources, with, as I mentioned, having to homeschool kids, having to go out, buy essentials, all those things. I think, that were not something that we didn't really have to think about too much beforehand. So that's quite a key consideration. So I think because we have obviously have physical distance from our managers and our leaders, there is now a pressure to overcompensate by making sure that we're always on, we're always responding, even faster than what we typically had to do in the work environment. So I think the leaders need to then set the tone, to say, look, in as much as we're working from home, we still should have demarcated hours for rest, right? So for example, I know in some organizations, you're not allowed to set meetings after a particular hour, even during lunchtime. And I think this is really to force people to kind of have that restful period. And I think more importantly, to make sure that, there isn't this invasion of the workspace into our homes.
Interesting. And what are the telltale signs that a company or an employer needs to look out for when an employee is struggling? Is there something that they need to watch out for that will indicate that the employee is struggling is psychologically in terms of being detached perhaps from the team, feeling a little bit depressed?
Yeah, I think because many of us, because we're used to operating in a structured environment and now we've got sovereignty over our time. So we might actually find that we're not taking enough breaks. Whereas when you're at the office, you kind of are compelled to go down to the canteen, walk over to the coffee station and make yourself coffee. So I think it's quite important to block out rest times, right? So if you typically took your lunch between 1 and 2, make sure that that is blocked out daily in your diary, because then it forces you to have a break, in between, because I think that's quite important in maintaining productivity. Also, similarly, is to try and have some sort of structure. So trying to mimic the structure that you had at work, right? So if you typically started working at about 8, and knocked up at about 5, trying to sort of like resemble that is then also going to be useful, I think, just to make sure that you do have that, dedicated allocation to your work time. It's very important to also contract with your family, right? Because they're not used to you being at home all the time, right? So in that regard, they might feel like, when you're working, they can pop in, have a chat with you, say, come, let's go watch this program, whatever the case might be. So it's very important to contract with your family around what your work day looks like, when they can interrupt you, when they mustn't interrupt you. So I think, that's always a key one, particularly just to make sure that you minimize disruptions that might come from your environment. And I think a key one as well is having a dedicated workstation, whatever that might look like. So not everyone has a home office, right? But have a station which you actually associate with work time. And that way it also helps you to sort of like, mentally check in and mentally check out of work. It's also important to make sure that the places that you associate with your leisure, are not also the same places that you work, because then otherwise you always, are always online and you don't feel that you've taken a break, because there's that conflation between the two environments.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Mohammed. So today, our key takeouts are that on the part of a company, there are a number of things that a company needs to ensure and watch out for. Likewise, for employees, there are a number of watch-outs and a number of things that the employee needs to take care of, including making sure that they take sufficient breaks, create structure in their new working environment, and know what the do's and don'ts are to ensure that they perform optimally in order to do a great job.